Hello, everyone. I'm Jean Boudot, and I'm a senior consultant from Brandwood CKC. I wish you a warm welcome to our September 2020 webinar. As you know, the world has been affected in an unprecedented manner over the past couple of months by COVID-19. And so this month, we'll take an opportunity to review its impact on 3 of the major regulators. Just a high-level introduction before we get started. In case you don't know us, so we are specialized in quality assurance, regulatory affairs, commercialization, and reimbursement. We are a consultancy based in Sydney, Australia, with some headquartered in Sydney, but with some offices around the world. We've been in the business for over 20 years, and we help a wide range of companies, starting from startups to multinationals in implementing global commercial and development strategies. So today I'm lucky to be joined by one of our medical device and IVD experts, Ursula Regaglia, who's been supporting a number of our clients in their pre-market and post-market challenges, and particularly in these unprecedented times. So Ursula, please give us a quick introduction.
Thank you, John. Welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Ursula Regaglia. I come with over 10 years of experience in research and development, 10 years of medical device experience, starting from a small startup all the way up to multinational companies. I joined Brandwood. I've been here for about 18 months, and at the moment, heavily concentrated on the Australian and New Zealand sponsorship and post-market activities, as well as in vitro diagnostic applications.
Thanks, Ursula. And so I'm Jean Boudot. I joined the consultancy in early 2017. I'm currently team lead and senior consultant for medical device and the IVD division of the company. I spent the last 15 years in a range of highly regulated fields, obviously medical devices, but also in the mining sector, aerospace and automotive sectors. So prior to joining Brandwood CKC, I held positions as regulatory affairs manager in a multinational, quality auditor, QA manager, and some roles in project management and product development as well. So in terms of our agenda today, obviously we'll start with providing a bit of a context to the coronavirus pandemic. We'll then look into some of the medical devices and IVDs which have been recognized as being essential to the response to the pandemic. And then we'll move on to discuss 3 major regulators and their local responses to the pandemic in terms of regulatory models, specific guidance, etc. We'll then conclude on the impact that the pandemic has had on the various market players and obviously the regulators. And we'll finish up with a Q&A. So I'd like to thank anyone who's been able to send some questions ahead of time. We're obviously going to focus primarily on those questions that we've received, but if you do have any other questions which may arise along the way, we'll provide some details at the end of the presentation for you to reach out, and we'll be more than happy to assist. I'm now going to hand over to Ursula, who will provide the context of the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you, Jean. This slide really is just a brief outline of how we've gotten into this situation and the worldwide increase in total number of cases of people who have had or have coronavirus. And it shows that there's been an increasing issue within the world, and control of this issue is paramount to patient and population safety. So what we've provided here is an outline of the market forces that have impacted the pandemic situation and how each market player and stakeholder within the regulatory pathway has been affected by coronavirus. So we start at the patients, and it's critical that the patients and the population are able to get timely treatment and are able to access personal protective equipment that is sufficient to control the transmission of the disease. We have healthcare facilities which required large stockpiles of personal protective equipment, ventilators, ICU equipment, and coronavirus testing to be able to provide the patients with quality care required. It's important to note that even before the World Health Organization announced that this was a global pandemic, they had already assessed that the global stockpile of personal protective equipment was insufficient in the event of a pandemic, and that supplies of gowns and goggles was likely to be insufficient. We also had manufacturers and supply chains who were trying very hard to increase production to be able to meet the market requirements. We also saw a number of manufacturers shift priorities within their organisation to be able to meet the market requirements for coronavirus equipment. And we also have seen that regulators have had to balance the safeguarding and enhancement of the community against the increasing requirements of that population. They have had to balance the risk and benefits in their regulatory responses and had to pivot very quickly in responses and actions to ensure that they could meet the required demands.
So I think when this shows here is there's obviously different players with different sets of priorities, different forces in the dynamic of the coronavirus. We have patients, that are expecting, rightly so, effective treatment and options for, responding to this pandemic or staying safe in this pandemic. We have regulators that still want to focus on bringing that safety, but at the same time, we need to have, a quick response and availability of equipment. So it's a very complicated equation that everyone had to respond to. And as we'll see a bit later, there will be a number of dispositions which have been put in place to do things differently and to be able to respond to this unique situation.
And just on that note as well, regulators had to continue to process applications and their normal activities within this context. So
exactly.
It made it very difficult for regulators. So what we have here is a condensed version of guidance from the World Health Organization, the FDA, Europe, and Australia, identifying the essential medical devices in response to COVID-19, and they are varied. They start at patient triage with low-risk devices such as masks and gowns, all the way up to life-saving and life-affirming equipment such as ventilators and airway management, which would be critical if patients required intensive care. We also saw an increase in pathology testing devices. The requirement for rapid tests and sensitive and specific pathology tests were needed to be able to diagnose patients with COVID-19. It should be noted that many of these regulators also put out guidance as to where personal protective equipment started and where medical device intended uses ended. And that had to be very clearly articulated by the regulators, because things like hand sanitizers and disinfectants are both commercial products and medical devices. So talking back to that very quick and rapid pivot by the regulators, guidance documents were made available regarding what is a medical device and what is a commercial product. So what we'll do here is we'll go through the responses made in the USA by the FDA. And it should be noted that there was still access to Class 1 listing and Class 2 exempt devices, so the normal pathways were also available to manufacturers. But the FDA added to their emergency use authorization a number of COVID-related products, and it enabled manufacturers to get exemptions to be able to provide these products for the emergency use. And there are two pathways in this process. There's an individual EUA where a manufacturer would put in an application for a particular device on its own. But we've also seen what's called an umbrella EUA, where products could be, a Me Too product could be attached to an existing EUA, and it was just an update. It was more of a product specific rather than an individual product specific EUA. And the EUA covered a multitude of PPE equipment, COVID-19 tests, and ventilators, which were found to be required in this emergency. We also have seen that there has been an increase in the guidance documents that have been provided by the FDA, and especially required guidance around those COVID-19 applications. We've also seen some post-market processes being strengthened or modified to include these COVID-19 devices. So we've noticed an increased scrutiny in the enforcement of false or unsupported claims, and that's been seen throughout most of the regulators. And we've also noted that adverse event reporting also is part of now the EUA COVID-19 products.
So really one thing I just want to add is we basically, when a medical device, particularly class 2 medical device, you need to normally be cleared through, for example, a 510K process in the US. This is a process which will take obviously months and months, between 3 to 6, in certain instances more. In the case of an emergency response authorization, we have seen, from the beginning to the end, a process which may take about a week. So this is one of the pathways which has helped to expedite the approval of devices in the context of COVID, for the duration of COVID, and with those specific intended uses. The guidance documents there, which we've been talking about, were those which highlighted some enforcement discretion, so alternate ways to comply with specific performance specifications, those type of things. It's also worth noting the inside of the emergency use authorizations, there was quite a lot of information in terms of data set requirements for certain devices. So we invite you to actually have a look at those emergency use authorizations, which are established specifically for the type of product, and to review what might be acceptable for the device in the context of that COVID-19 pandemic. Another point is, as part of this post-market phase, obviously, when an emergency use authorization is granted, they do come with some specific conditions in the post-market phase, which include the standard adverse event reporting to make sure that not only the process has been expedited, but there is, of course, still an opportunity to track the field experience and provide this feedback loop to the regulator to monitor the ongoing safety of the device.
And to that end, we've just provided an example list of over 30 guidance documents that the FDA have recently issued regarding COVID-19 medical devices. And it is an extensive list, and it does cover a great deal of products, and especially critical healthcare products. And now I'll hand back to Jean, who will take you through the European response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Ursula. So in terms of Europe, so obviously, whilst the medical devices are falling under the rules of MDD 9342 EEC and are currently transitioning to the new regulation MDR, the 2017-745, to really ensure the availability of those COVID critical equipment, and also help with a collaboration between the various economic operators and the member state authority, the European Commission has issued a recommendation in March 2020 of this year, which is the recommendation 2020-403 on conformity assessment and market surveillance procedures within the context of COVID-19 threat. So within this recommendation, the Commission authorizes member states to authorize derogation from conformity assessment procedures. Now, so we know in Europe that prior to marketing a medical device in any of the member states, medical devices need to undertake a conformity assessment procedure. Depending on the class of the device, those conformity assessment procedures are undertaken by a notified body. And what's interesting here is within those recommendations, there is an emergency derogation which allows manufacturers and commercial operators to directly deal essentially with one of those member states and try and obtain a derogation for temporary validity of a product during the COVID pandemic. So obviously those authorizations are still based on the degree of criticality of the device and the risk-benefit ratio that it provides in the context of the pandemic. It's also looking at whether or not there are suitable substitutes that are normally marketed in the regions, and it's based obviously on the overall safety data which is available for those products, the technical solutions which have been offered, and a review is performed by the competent body, whether or not a review has been performed by a competent body prior, etc., etc. So it's an interesting provision which has been put in place here to again expedite access within the local market to those critical equipment. Other types of responses. So there are emergency legislations to control the export of personal protective equipment. So this is obviously to ensure that the priority is given to that member state. There's also establishment of COVID-19 clearinghouse for medical equipment. So this is really more so of an information exchange for the member state in relation to stocks, to levels of stocks and demand, really to help and facilitate the availability of those critical equipment. Another thing which we've seen to help manufacturers and commercial players to release medical devices which were in demand during the pandemic is in terms of the local institutes for standardization, free access to national adoptions of European standards were provided. So there were a range of standards which came available for free, either online or in some instances downloadable for specialized equipment such as the medical gloves, medical face masks, but also more general standards such as biocompatibility evaluations. In addition to the standards, there is a range of working and guidance documents which are useful to be consulted. There is a current performance of COVID-19 test methods and device, which is very interesting to consult. It provides really a body of performance evaluation which is relevant for consideration in the development of test methods for COVID. There's guidance on reg requirements for medical face masks as well. And obviously, we've seen first from the UK, who we all know is exiting the European Union, some specifications in relation to the rapid manufacture of ventilator systems. And this was later adopted by other regulators, both in Australia and in other jurisdictions as well. Interestingly, there was also a guidance document published, which is called the EC Guidance on Medical Device, Active Implantable Medical Devices and In Vitro Diagnostic in the COVID-19 context. This was published in April 2020. And what's interesting in there is the inclusion in Annex 1 of a list of harmonized standards which are directly relevant to those critical equipment in the response. So obviously, we've seen a number of clients and also new players asking what standards may exist in relation to medical devices. This is a good place to start because it's essentially a subset of all of the harmonized standards with a specific focus on those critical equipment. Now, if we look at not only the available resources which may be used in the response to this pandemic, but instead look at the impact that those changes have had on the broader regulation and the framework itself. So obviously, as we know, the medical device regulation is one of the main changes which is happening currently in Europe in the space of medical device. In fact, not just the medical device regulation, but also the in vitro diagnostic regulation. And we've seen obviously the deadline for implementation being extended to May 2021. So within this context, notified bodies which have been designated to conduct audits to the previous regulation may continue to do so until May 2021. There is an interesting factor, which is there's no actual change to the grace period. So if you do have currently a medical device, a certificate which was issued under the Medical Device Directive, the expiry of that certificate still remains May 2024. So only the initial deadline has been postponed, but the actual grace period itself has not changed. Another interesting guidance or measure which was put in place is that the notified bodies, obviously as part of the validity of the certificates, the issue of the certificates for CE marking, are required to perform some audits of manufacturers, whether that be for initial certifications or for follow-up certifications and follow-up audits. In the instance of COVID, and due to the quarantine orders and travel restrictions, a possibility was made for remote auditing. Now, there is a limitation to those remote audits. This is a decision which is made by the notified body and which is a risk-based decision. This is only available for established manufacturers. It's not available for initial assessments or for major scopes as extension of the quality management system. So we are only talking here about remote auditing, essentially for follow-up audits and the continuity of conformity within the contractual arrangements. And there was also a provision for clinically necessary devices, right? So where, again, there is a focus on those devices which contribute to the COVID response. We have seen this deadline being extended for the Medical Device Directive. At the moment, there is no change to the IVDR deadline, which means that the commencement date is still set for May 2022. I'd like now to hand over back to Ursula, who will be talking about the regional response for Australia.
Thanks, John. So what we've seen in Australia is a willingness by the regulator to put in place a number of measures in order to ensure that COVID-19 medical devices had priority within the regulatory system. This change didn't affect the pre-market process for Class 1 devices, which remained auto-included on the ARTG, but it did mean that any Class 1 sterile products, Class 1 measuring products, all the way up to Class 3 products and IVDs that were related to COVID-19 were fast-tracked through the system. The priority reviews, especially for those applications that required further investigation or application audits, we noted that the TGA were fast-tracking these processes and also starting to review the applications prior to the necessary fees being paid, which is quite a generous thing to do, especially for a regulator. And we also noticed a real significant turnaround time in the responses from the regulator, from the TGA, regarding these applications. There were 6 separate pieces of legislation specifically around the COVID-19 test response. The COVID-19 medical device response, and it included exemptions from certain requirements of the pre-market process. What we've seen and what was very interesting was exemptions around the corona testing by accredited pathology labs, the exemption from domestic manufacture and supply of ventilators, and the federal government purchasing of non-approved devices for emergency use. All of these put Australia in a very good position to deal with the coronavirus. It should be noted that most of these emergency response legislations are due to be sunsetted in January next year, so 2021. Due to the increasing market demand and concerns, the TGA also put in place a number of post-market processes that were required by medical device sponsors and manufacturers. They've increased the specific conditions for inclusion for a number of the test kits. So the test kits now are required to provide annual and monthly reports to the TGA. The TGA also requested under what's called an S41JA, request for further information, and the S41FN, request for samples. And they used both of these judiciously on products where they felt that the quality was required to be tested. They've also expedited recall pathways. So in the event that a COVID-19 device requires recall, the TGA have mandated a response time of 24 hours. What we are also seeing is that the TGA are being very diligent in their reinforcement of advertising guidelines. We have seen an uptick of the TGA issuing fines and notices to manufacturers and sponsors who are not complying with the advertising guidelines. Amongst the legislative changes, the TGA also have put out a number of standards or requirements, especially around the COVID-19 personal protective equipment and ventilators. So the TGA have put out guidance about what are the requirements and obligations of being a sponsor of a PPE product on the market, and it includes a number of details about how to show compliance to the TGA legislation and requirements. They've also put out a ventilator minimum performance and feature specifications for hospital ventilators. This actually mirrored the UK document very closely and provides manufacturers with a good idea about what the minimum performance requirements and specifications the TGA are looking for when they include a ventilator on the ARTG.
So if we look at the regulatory impact of this COVID pandemic still with the TGA, obviously similar to as we've seen for Europe, there has been some delays or extensions of timeframes for implementation of certain schemes. And in particular, we've seen that new rulings were implemented for medical device software following the INDRF recommendations. 6 months extra have been provided here for the deadline for implementation. Similarly, for personalized medical devices, which include those 3D printed devices, guidances have been put together, and not only guidances, but new regulations were placed together for definitions, classifications, including for the production systems for those custom devices. And the deadline has been pushed again by 6 months. We've also seen some delays or extra time being given to the reclassification of certain devices. This included the reclassification of spinal implantables from 2Bs to class 3s, active implantable medical device from AIMDs to 3, medical devices that administer medicines. So we had combinations of class 1 and 2As at the moment, which are being bumped in classification to 2A, 2B, etc., etc. So all of those reclassifications are now being postponed to November 2021. Also in November 2021, the licensing structure for individual components and pack systems or procedure packs has also been postponed and will come into effect in November 2021. Also in the pipeline of changes with the TGA were amendments to the essential principles in the medical device regulations, and this implementation has also been delayed for up to 2 years. This is mostly to align with the MDR timeframes and the commencement of the 2017 745.
Just quickly, it should also be noted that with the TGA, any changes to the regulations that were already in transition, there's been no change to those deadlines. So that includes the up classification of surgical meshes, and the implementation of patient information leaflets and product implant cards. Those are still due by the same deadlines. Those deadlines have not been moved by the TGA.
That's right. So really some additional time given to manufacturers, but none of this work has been stalled by any means. So it's all still ongoing, and this is really to provide additional room and help with that reprioritization to the response of the COVID-19, but everything is still going. So really, in conclusion, obviously, the COVID-19 has had a very broad impact, affecting all commercial operators and all of the regulators. We've provided here an update for 3 main jurisdictions, but these changes, have really happened around the world. It did require all of those commercial operators to make very quick adjustments in reacting to this crisis environment. We've seen a blend of openness probably to new rules, but also a level of protectionism, and particularly of the public, where, as was the case before, but still in the context of a response to crisis and a rapid response, the data is still king. So although we do need to access technology quickly, this access is not at all cost. Safety and efficacy is still required, and the role of the regulator is to protect the public. So the rules which have been put in place, are really trying to support this this philosophy, and that remains where safety and efficacy data is still what prevails. As expected, obviously, there was a strong focus on from the entire world on critical COVID response equipment. So what this has done is delaying some of the programs, but as we just discussed, these are not stalled by any means, and everything continues to progress. So the programs themselves continue to progress. Reviews of other pieces of equipment also continue to progress. So the work is still being completed. There's ongoing work to support and advance COVID-19 diagnostic. As we know, this is a very critical area of innovation and progress, which is required to exit this pandemic. There's more guidance being written. additional clinical evidence, obviously, as we obtain more field experience is being built up. And so we'll provide an update through our blogs or through other mechanisms to inform on what comes available. We have seen a ramp up of post-market activities in relation to COVID products particularly, and this was around adverse events, the advertising reinforcements, so lab testing as well, request for information. So of course, there were concessions and facilitations in the pre-market phase to ensure quick access to those technologies, but there is obviously more emphasis in this context on the post-market phase. So this is a measure which is put in place again to maintain this balance between the openness and the protectionism as we discussed previously. We'll provide some time now for some Q&A, addressing some of the questions which we've received ahead of time. One of the first questions that we received was in regards to the EUA, so the emergency use authorization in the USA. And the question was whether or not it was too late to apply for an EUA, with a specific comment made that the last one seen online was from June. So Ursula, do you want to provide a perspective on this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sean. We had a check of this. It is not too late to put in your emergency use authorization application. In fact, we at Brandwood are currently progressing one at the moment. So it is not too late. You can continue to put in your EUA applications to the FDA. And in fact, John and I had a quick check this week to see what was happening with the EUAs and whether or not the approvals had stalled. And we found that there were still products being approved under the EUA, both individually and under the umbrella EUA program. So it may have been that there was an influx of EUA umbrella approvals coming through, or that it was just a delay in the system updating. But certainly both Sean and I reviewed, and this week a number of products were authorised to be used under the EUA system in the US.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have seen some EUAs dated September, so really approved as late as this week. And as Ursula mentioned, whilst there are some individual EUAs, what needs to be considered also is some of the products will be added to an existing EUA, generally in the annex. So, the fact that there is not necessarily a new entry or a brand new EUA does not mean that the EUAs are still not active. And so it's not too late. You can still use this pathway. And if it meets, the requirement of the program, then this is definitely an opportunity for manufacturers to be used and obtain and be able to serve the public with those quicker reviews. So another question was in relation to the UK. So obviously we have covered some elements of Europe, and we have seen some similar aspects in the UK. Ursula, what do you think? Is there anything in particular that is worth noting for the UK in terms of that response to COVID?
So there is, as many of the European countries have put in place, is an exceptional use application or authorization in which the regional health authorities are actually allowing medical devices that are currently being looked at by the notified bodies an opportunity to be on the market and used during the COVID-19 pandemic. The list is not dissimilar to the list we presented earlier, in which we're talking about personal protective equipment used in triage of patients, all the way up to ventilators being used in ICU. And there are some very good guidance on the government UK site, which provides details of how to apply that. It's not a form in the formal sense like the FDA have, but there are certainly pathways through the UK for exceptional use authorizations.
Excellent. So there was a question slightly different here. Now, if we move back to here down under, so more specifically around this response to COVID, obviously, has some impact on other kind of devices. And the question here is, what sort of impact have you experienced on the TGA approvals for non-COVID items?
Yeah, we have to acknowledge the TGA, I believe, has done an exceptional job with the resources that they have. But unfortunately, the resources have been earmarked for COVID-19 applications at the moment. We are seeing a delay, but certainly, and maybe a slowdown, but we certainly are getting applications through the regulator, through the TGA. We are working closely with a number of the reviews at the TGA to make sure that our applications are being progressed. A little bit of understanding by both parties has meant that this has been relatively a smooth process, but we have noticed that COVID-19 applications are given priority, and that applications not related to COVID-19 are being slightly delayed. What we're talking about is, say, for a Class 2B product, we're looking for a little bit more, a couple of weeks or about a month extension of what we would normally expect for an approval or an inclusion, in fact.
Yeah, I agree. So, of course, one of the main themes, which we've presented in this webinar is that question of prioritization, to the COVID-19 response. And of course, a substantial portion of the resources are taken away to first address, the critical equipment, which are essential to this response. Now, we have seen and have supported a number of applications for other devices which are not directly related to COVID. And whilst there has been some delays, we still have received some approvals. We've put some application through and have seen no problems in particular with those. It's also worth noting that, all around the world at the moment, a very similar situation is experienced, whether that be in Europe, especially in the context of the transition to MDR and other forces which are playing. So those delays are not dissimilar to other regions, and Australia is still an attractive market. So that's really our experience with the TGA and those other non-COVID items. What about the post-market experience? So what sort of post-market activity have we faced?
In fact, if there's been a very interesting outcome from the COVID-19 pandemic, is the increase in post-market activities by the TGA, especially around sampling. In this period, we're seeing that gowns, masks, COVID-19 test kits in sample numbers have been provided or are required to be provided to the TGA for testing. They have set up agreements with a number of commercial entities and government entities to undertake those testing. We noticed also that very early on, the TGA were requesting information quite broadly. In times at the beginning of the pandemic, very broad requests for information, and sampling sizes that were quite large. What we're seeing now is an increasing sophistication in the way that the TGA are requesting samples and are requesting further information under that S41JA requests. So we're seeing very interesting developments out of the TGA, and an increasing sophistication in the way that they are approaching post-market testing and requests.
Yeah, definitely an emphasis on the supporting data. So, for instance, if claims have been made of compliance to certain standards, then we have seen TGA requesting for test reports, which should be in place in any case in the technical file of the device. So There's nothing really exotic there, but obviously a strong emphasis on those post-market activities, on claim substantiation and provision of evidence to claim standards and other safety aspects of the product.
Absolutely.
So, of course, to conclude, so the situation here is evolving rapidly. So all regulators are active, I think, with guidance documents that have been put in place as experience grows. We will still continue to update via our blogs, webinars, our newsletter, and any other platform. However, if you do have any other questions that we may not have addressed as part of this webinar, there's many ways that you can reach out to us. So you'll see you can reach out to us online. We've got an email here displayed on the screen. We'll be pleased to hear from you, and we're looking forward to assist. So thanks again, everyone, for listening. Stay safe, and we look forward to welcome you again at our next webinar. Goodbye for now.
Bye, everyone.